A Russian Mi-8 helicopter drops into the Black Sea, not hit by a missile, not caught by a fighter jet, taken down by a machine that looks like a jet ski with a warhead bolted to the front. A Ukrainian Magura drone, skimming the waves, doing something no naval drone had done before it. Open-source trackers and Ukrainian officials both flagged it as a world first. A surface drone shooting a helicopter out of the sky. Watch the footage that circulated afterward, and you can see how thin the margin was. A low, dark shape cutting a white wake against black water. A helicopter banking to line up a gun run on what its crew probably assumed was just another small boat, and then a flash, and then nothing where the helicopter used to be. Analysts who reviewed the clip frame by frame noted the drone never altered course. It didn't need to evade. It needed the helicopter to come close enough, and the helicopter did. Zoom into that clip a little further, and the tactical picture gets stranger. The helicopter's crew had almost certainly logged dozens of routine patrol hours over that stretch of water, scanning for exactly the kind of small craft that used to mean nothing. Fishing skiffs, debris, the occasional stray mine drifting off its mooring. Nothing in their training had taught them to treat a low, dark shape skimming the surface as capable of shooting back. That's the assumption the drone was built to exploit. Ukrainian operators reportedly waited for the helicopter to descend and slow for its gun run, the exact maneuver that would have worked against an unarmed boat before the drone's own weapon system engaged. The margin for error ran in both directions. For the drone, a wrong angle or an early shot wastes the platform. For the helicopter, closing the distance to confirm a target it had already misjudged became the last decision its crew made. Now ask the question Russian commanders are quietly asking in 2026. If a few $100,000 of fiberglass and battery can reach out and drop a helicopter, what happens when the target isn't moving through the air? What happens when it's a landing ship worth low hundreds of millions of dollars, sitting still, tied up in a harbor its own navy swore was too far away to matter? That harbor has a name, Ochamchire, a small port on the Abkhaz coast, deep inside a breakaway region of Georgia that Russia has propped up for decades, roughly 600 kilometers from the Ukrainian-controlled waters where these drones actually launch. On a map, it looks like a rounding error, a smudge of coastline south of Sukhumi, wedged between low hills and a stretch of water that used to be a Soviet resort coast. Satellite imagery from earlier this year shows a modest breakwater, 2 short piers, a handful of warehouse buildings, and none of the layered concrete revetments or hardened pens that mark a facility built to survive a determined attack. It was never meant to be a fortress, it was meant to be forgettable. For most of this war, Ochamchire has been sold inside Russian military circles as the answer to a problem nobody wanted to say out loud. Crimea isn't safe anymore. Sevastopol isn't safe anymore. So take the ships that matter most, the Ropucha-class landing ships that keep the amphibious force alive, and put them somewhere the sea drones supposedly can't reach. This video walks through why that belief might already be an illusion. We'll look at what a Ropucha actually does for Russia's navy, why losing more of them would hurt in ways that go beyond one ship, what the port at Ochamchire actually offers as a hiding spot, and what years of Ukrainian sea drone development say about how long a haven defended only by kilometers stays a haven. By the end, you'll understand exactly why ship trackers, satellite imagery, and Ukrainian naval intelligence statements keep circling back to this one stretch of Abkhaz coastline in 2026. Start with the ship itself. A Ropucha is not a warship built to fight other warships. It's a landing ship, a Cold War-era Soviet design, built to run straight up onto a beach, drop its bow ramp, and pour out tanks, troops, and equipment. Russia's Black Sea Fleet built its entire amphibious posture around a handful of these vessels. Lose enough of them, and the fleet loses the ability to put an armored force ashore anywhere at all. Each hull runs roughly 113 meters long, displaces somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 tons fully loaded, and carries a crew that typically numbers between 50 and 90 sailors, depending on cargo and mission profile. Below decks, there's a tank deck long enough to hold a company of armor, bunks stacked 3 high in cramped berthing compartments, and a galley that feeds everyone the same thin rotation of preserved rations on a long transit. These are not glamorous ships. They were never meant to be. They were meant to be workhorses, and a navy without workhorses can't move an army anywhere that doesn't already have a runway or a rail line. That workhorse role is exactly what makes the loss of a Ropucha so different from the loss of, say, a patrol boat or a corvette. Picture the sailors who actually crew one of these ships. Young conscripts and contract sailors, many barely out of their teens, standing watch in engine rooms that smell permanently of diesel and salt, sleeping in compartments where the paint has been chipping since before some of them were born. When a Ropucha goes down, it isn't an abstraction on a naval order of battle chart. It's dozens of families getting the kind of phone call that never gets easier to make, in a country where the military has grown increasingly careful about how those numbers get reported at all. Ukrainian strikes on ships of this class earlier in the war produced exactly that pattern. Official Russian statements describing an incident or a fire, while independent trackers and, in some cases, grieving relatives posting online, told a fuller story the Ministry of Defense never confirmed outright. Consider one of those earlier losses in more human terms. Survivors and family accounts that surfaced after an earlier Ropucha sinking described a junior engineer barely 20 years old, assigned to the ship's diesel plant less than a year before the strike, the kind of posting that in peacetime would have meant a quiet, unremarkable career. His mother reportedly learned of the sinking not through any official notification, but through a regional social media group where relatives of Black Sea Fleet sailors had begun quietly comparing notes, because official channels had gone silent for days. That pattern, silence from the ministry, information trickling out sideways through grieving families instead, has repeated often enough over this war that Russian military bloggers themselves have started commenting on it, some more critically than the Ministry of Defense would prefer. That's why the math matters so much to Moscow. Naval analysts and open-source trackers put the value of a single Ropucha-class ship in the low hundreds of millions of dollars once you account for the hull, the propulsion plant, and everything loaded aboard it. Armor, ammunition, sometimes helicopters or landing craft carried piggyback for a beach assault. Compare that figure to what it would cost Russia to simply build a replacement today. The shipyards capable of laying down a comparable amphibious hull are either sanctioned out of key components, tied up building submarines and frigates for other fleets, or, in some cases, no longer capable of the work at all after decades of underinvestment. Russia doesn't build these anymore in any meaningful number. Everyone still afloat is effectively irreplaceable on any timeline that matters for this war. And Russia has already lost several. Ships of exactly this class have been struck and sunk earlier in the conflict, picked off in ports that once felt untouchable. One was hit at anchor near Berdyansk early in the invasion, a strike that also damaged port infrastructure Russia had been using to resupply its southern axis. Others have been struck in dry dock, caught mid-repair with weapons systems stripped down, and no ability to maneuver or fight back. Each loss didn't just remove a hull from the order of battle. It removed capacity Russia cannot rebuild at the shipyards it currently has access to, and it removed institutional knowledge, trained crews, maintenance routines, the accumulated small competencies that keep an aging Soviet-era ship actually running, that doesn't transfer easily to whatever replacement eventually gets built, if one ever does. Here's what's most surprising about this story. It isn't really about a drone. It's about a decision. Russian commanders looked at a map, decided distance itself was a form of armor, and moved their most valuable amphibious assets 600 kilometers away from the fight to prove it. Compare that to what those ships gave up. Sevastopol, for all its exposure, sat under layered air defense. S-400 batteries positioned on the high ground above the harbor, Pantsir short-range systems clustered around key naval infrastructure, electronic warfare coverage blanketing the approaches, hardened piers, decades of naval infrastructure built specifically to protect ships at anchor. Radar coverage there was dense enough, in theory, to track a seagull. Ochamchire offers almost none of that. A quieter berth, a shorter dock, and a much thinner defensive umbrella. Open-source imagery suggests light air defense presence at best, nothing resembling the concentric rings of coverage that once made Sevastopol feel, at least on paper, like the safest naval anchorage in the Black Sea. Russia traded hardened protection for obscurity. The question this video keeps returning to is simple. How long does obscurity actually last once someone starts looking? To understand why Moscow made that trade, you have to rewind through what actually happened to the Black Sea Fleet's position in Crimea. Early in the full-scale invasion, Russia treated Sevastopol as an unshakable fortress, the historic home of its Black Sea Fleet. Ringed with air defense, protected by geography and by decades of naval tradition. That confidence didn't survive contact with reality. Ukraine's cruise missile strikes, its long-range drone raids, and its surface sea drone campaign chipped away at that fortress piece by piece. A guided missile cruiser, the fleet's flagship, was sunk by anti-ship missiles early in the war, a loss so significant it reshaped how the entire Russian Navy thought about operating near Crimea. Submarines and landing ships were struck inside supposedly protected dry docks. A Kilo-class submarine and a Ropucha-class landing ship were hit in the same strike on occupied Sevastopol's main shipyard. Images of the submarine's pressure hull peeled open like a tin can circulating within hours across every open-source intelligence channel tracking the war. Command infrastructure was hit, including the fleet headquarters building itself. Air defense radars were blinded by follow-up strikes timed specifically to catch repair crews still working on the damage from the last one. In the aftermath of strikes like these, Russian forces began recovering drone wreckage, washed up along the Crimean coastline, and what they found in the debris became its own quiet source of anxiety inside the fleet's intelligence circles. Downed or beached Magura hulls, when recovered mostly intact, gave Russian technicians a look at exactly what they were up against: commercial-grade navigation modules, satellite communication antennas, small enough to hide under a thin composite shell, warhead compartments sized and shaped for maximum effect against a hull's waterline rather than its superstructure. Debriefs of the recovery teams, portions of which surfaced later through leaked or captured documentation cited by open-source researchers, reportedly described frustration at how little useful intelligence the wreckage actually yielded. The navigation systems were built to wipe themselves or fail safe on capture. The components were largely commercial, off-the-shelf, and untraceable to any single supplier in a way that would let Russian counterintelligence roll up a supply chain. Some reports even suggested Russian technicians disagreed internally about whether the drones represented a serious industrial threat or an improvised nuisance that better point defense drills would eventually neutralize. A disagreement that, 3 years on, the loss ledger has already answered. Whatever Russia learned from those recovered hulls, it clearly wasn't enough to stop the pattern from repeating. On the Ukrainian side of that same exchange, the work looks almost administrative by comparison, and that's precisely what makes it effective. Naval intelligence analysts reportedly spend their days doing something closer to accounting than combat, cross-referencing commercial satellite passes against ship tracker transponder gaps, flagging every unexplained absence of a hull from its usual anchorage, building a rolling picture of where the fleet's most valuable ships are likely sitting on any given week. It's unglamorous work, done mostly on laptops in offices, far from any coastline, and it rarely produces a dramatic headline on its own. But it's the layer underneath every successful strike this war has produced, the patient accumulation of ordinary-looking data points that eventually tells you exactly which pier a landing ship has been tied up against for the last 6 weeks. Piece by piece, Sevastopol stopped being a fortress and started being a liability. Ships that once sat proudly at anchor began quietly slipping east, toward Novorossiysk, on Russia's own mainland coast, a relocation Russian officials never announced outright, but one that ship trackers, satellite imagery, and open-source naval analysts documented in real time. Novorossiysk was supposed to be the fix. Further from Ukrainian-controlled shoreline, ringed by its own defenses, close enough to still support operations. It didn't hold either. Ukrainian sea drones reached Novorossiysk too, striking a large landing ship at anchor there, and, in a separate raid, hitting a patrol vessel that had been specifically tasked with hunting sea drones along that stretch of coast, an irony that wasn't lost on the analysts tracking it. Additional raids forced yet another round of dispersal, with satellite imagery later showing a noticeably thinner concentration of vessels at the port than had been present just months earlier. That's twice now that the Black Sea Fleet has relocated its most valuable ships, specifically because Ukrainian naval drones made the previous location untenable. That's the pattern worth sitting with for a second. Not a single dramatic defeat, but a slow, repeated retreat. Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, and then, for at least part of the amphibious force, onward again toward Abkhazia and the port at Ochamchire. Each move was framed publicly as routine repositioning. Each move was, in practice, an admission that the previous safe harbor wasn't safe anymore. Here's the part that doesn't quite add up if you only look at a map. Ochamchire isn't just far from Ukrainian-controlled shoreline, it's also far from the rest of Russia's logistics network, far from major shipyards, far from the dense air defense belts that protect Crimea and the Russian mainland coast. Moving ships there solves one problem and creates several others. Spare parts for these Soviet-era hulls now have to travel a longer, more circuitous route to reach the crews maintaining them. Fuel resupply becomes a longer round trip. Rotating crews on and off the ships means moving personnel through a region with limited civilian infrastructure. Connected to Russia proper mostly by a single stretch of coastal road and rail, stealth runs uncomfortably close to contested territory. None of that shows up in a simple map measurement of kilometers between Ukrainian-controlled water and an anchorage. All of it shows up in the day-to-day grind of actually keeping an aging amphibious fleet combat-ready. I spent time going through open-source ship tracker data and satellite passes covering this stretch of Abkhaz coast, and one detail kept nagging at me. The port itself is small, shallow, never built to host and protect capital naval assets long-term. You can see it in the imagery, vessels moored close together along a single stretch of quay, none of the dispersal or hardened bunkering you'd expect if this were meant to be a permanent, defensible naval base rather than a stopgap. Russian commanders picked it anyway, because by the time they were making that call, every other option on the Black Sea map had already proven vulnerable. So what exactly makes Ukraine's sea drones capable of closing a 600-kilometer gap that Russian planners apparently treated as a hard limit? This is where the Magura-family comes in, and where the arithmetic starts to get genuinely uncomfortable for anyone still betting on distance as protection. A Magura-family surface drone isn't a submarine. It isn't a missile. It's a low, fast, largely automated hull, a few $100,000 of composite material, an outboard-style engine, a navigation and camera package, and a warhead. Its profile above the waterline is small enough to be nearly invisible to conventional radar, especially at night, in chop, at a distance. Under the hood, so to speak, later variants reportedly carry electro-optical and infrared cameras for night operation, a satellite communication terminal that lets an operator maintain control well beyond line-of-sight radio range, and a warhead compartment in the bow, sized to punch through a steel hull below the waterline rather than simply scorch a superstructure. The whole package sits low enough in the water that even a trained lookout scanning the horizon with binoculars in daylight can mistake it for driftwood or a fishing buoy until it's already too close to matter. What it has that changes the entire calculation is endurance. These drones are built to run for hundreds of kilometers on a single mission, guided partly by satellite navigation and partly by onboard cameras and remote operators watching a video feed from thousands of kilometers away, sometimes from a bunker nowhere near the coast at all. Picture that control room for a second, because it's not what most people imagine when they hear the word drone operator. Not a windswept boat deck, not a soldier crouched behind a rock with a joystick. A converted room somewhere well inland, banks of monitors showing grainy low-light video, a small team working in rotating shifts because a 600-kilometer transit can take the better part of a day depending on speed and sea state. Operators reportedly train for months before being trusted with a live mission, running endless simulations against recorded footage of past transits, learning to read the subtle visual cues that separate a patrol boat's wake from a fishing trawler's at 2 in the morning through a camera that's bouncing on rough water. The psychological weight of the job isn't the same as being under fire, but people who've spoken about it in interviews describe a different kind of strain. Hours of monotonous transit punctuated by moments of extreme, high-stakes focus, knowing a single lapse in attention during the final approach can turn a multi-hour mission and a several $100,000 asset into nothing. Endurance turns geography into arithmetic. 600 kilometers from launch point to Ochamchire isn't a wall, it's a fuel question. It's a battery and range question. It is not, and never was, a hard physical barrier the way Russian planners appear to have treated it. That range didn't arrive by accident, and it didn't arrive easily. Early Magura variants had a fraction of the endurance needed to threaten a target this far south. Ukrainian naval drone units spent quiet, unglamorous months extending range, improving navigation resistance to jamming, and reworking hull design to cut drag and stretch every liter of fuel further. Engineers reportedly burned through failed prototypes that either lost signal too soon or simply ran out of range before reaching a target zone. Some early tests reportedly ended with drones going quiet mid-transit, their fate unknown for hours until wreckage, or nothing at all, eventually turned up. The fix wasn't one breakthrough. It was a long grind of incremental extensions. A slightly bigger fuel cell here, a lighter composite layup there, a navigation update that cut the rate of signal loss during rough water by some meaningful percentage. Each tested against exactly the kind of long-distance targets that used to be considered out of reach. That grind is precisely why a port 600 kilometers away isn't the finish line Russian commanders once assumed it was. It's a benchmark Ukrainian naval drone units have been quietly training toward reaching for a long time. Put yourself in the position of a Ukrainian naval drone operator for a second. You're not standing on a boat. You're in a room, watching a video feed from a camera skimming inches above the waterline, hundreds of kilometers from where you're sitting, correcting course by centimeters against waves you can't feel, while every second of transmission risks being detected and jammed. That's the job. That's what range actually means once you strip away the statistic. And it isn't hypothetical anymore. Ukrainian sea drones have already reached targets well outside what Russian defense planners assumed was their operational radius. They've forced the Black Sea Fleet to relocate twice. They've struck the Kerch Bridge, the single physical link between occupied Crimea and Russia's mainland, repeatedly enough that Russian engineers have had to keep refortifying it with additional barriers, anchored pontoons, and expanded security zones that now stretch kilometers out from the bridge itself. None of that was supposed to be possible according to the range assumptions Russian naval doctrine was built on at the start of the war. Here's the thing, this wasn't supposed to work. Naval drones were, for most of modern military history, a marginal concept. Expensive to develop, limited in payload, easy to dismiss next to a proper warship. And yet, in the Black Sea, they've done something no conventional Russian countermeasure has managed to stop. By the time the Black Sea Fleet's most vulnerable ships had been chased out of Sevastopol, and then out of Novorossiysk, there weren't many places left on the map that still felt safe. Ochamchire looked like the last good option. What Russian planners didn't fully reckon with is that Ukraine's naval drone program hadn't stopped growing every time the fleet ran further away. It had used each relocation as a new data point for how much further it needed to reach. Look at what's actually parked in that Abkhaz harbor right now, according to open-source ship tracking and satellite passes from earlier this year. Ropucha-class landing ships, escort vessels, the kind of amphibious force Russia can't afford to lose and can't currently replace at any meaningful pace. All of it sitting in a port that was never designed to defend capital naval assets against a determined, patient drone campaign. Before going further, it's worth sitting with what Ochamchire actually is politically, because that context shapes everything Russia can and can't do to defend it. Abkhazia isn't recognized by almost any country on Earth as anything other than Georgian territory under Russian occupation, a status that's remained essentially frozen since a brief war in the early 1990s and another round of fighting in 2008 cemented Russian troops there as a permanent fixture. Moscow maintains a military base agreement with the local authorities it installed, one that grants it use of ports like Ochamchire, but that arrangement was built around routine garrison duty, not around sheltering a navy's most valuable amphibious assets from a drone war nobody anticipated when the base agreements were signed. Upgrading Ochamchire's defenses into something resembling Sevastopol's would mean pouring resources into a facility inside contested, internationally unrecognized territory, a level of visible, sustained investment that would be hard to justify to Moscow's own military budget process, and hard to hide from the same satellite constellations already tracking every ship that comes and goes. There's a smaller, quieter version of this visibility problem playing out at ground level in Ochamchire itself. Local fishermen working the waters just outside the harbor mouth have reportedly grown used to the sight of gray-hulled warships tied up along the quay, a novelty in a town whose economy ran for decades on citrus groves and a modest tourist trade rather than naval logistics. Georgian officials in Tbilisi, who have never recognized Russia's presence in Abkhazia as legitimate in the first place, have occasionally noted the buildup in public statements without much practical ability to act on it. A reminder that the political status of that coastline is itself contested, layered on top of every military calculation Russian planners are making there. The Abkhaz coastline doesn't offer what Crimea offered. No dense belt of S-400 or Pantsir coverage built up over years specifically to protect the fleet. No hardened piers engineered for exactly this threat. What it offers instead is distance, and distance alone, as this war has shown more than once, has a shelf life. Something about that trade doesn't sit right, even now. Russia essentially bet its most valuable amphibious ships on the idea that Ukrainian drone range would stay fixed while everything else about this war kept changing. That's not how any weapons program in this conflict has behaved so far. Here's what strikes me about this specific case. It isn't really a story about one port or one class of ship. It's a story about what happens when a military keeps solving today's problem by running further away, without asking whether tomorrow's problem is just today's problem with a longer flight time attached. Let's talk about the exchange ratio, because this is the number that actually explains why this matters beyond one Georgian port. A Magura-family drone runs a few $100,000 once you account for hull, engine, navigation, and warhead. A Ropucha-class landing ship is valued, conservatively, in the low hundreds of millions. Even using cautious estimates, one successful hit represents an exchange ratio measured in the hundreds to 1. For comparison, a single advanced anti-ship missile of the kind Western Navy's field can run into the millions of dollars per unit, meaning even a traditional precision strike on a target this valuable would still be a lopsided trade in the defender's favor by normal standards. And the Magura numbers blow past even that. No conventional naval engagement in modern history has produced numbers like that with any regularity. That ratio is exactly why Russia keeps moving these ships instead of simply accepting occasional losses. Each Ropucha that's already been sunk earlier in this war represented not just a hull, but irreplaceable amphibious lift capacity Russia's current shipyards can't rebuild on any relevant timeline. Every relocation has been, in effect, an admission that the fleet cannot afford to keep testing that ratio. Unpopular opinion, and we'll say it directly, parking a fleet's most valuable amphibious assets 600 kilometers from the fight, in a port with minimal air defense coverage, isn't a defensive masterstroke. It's a delay tactic dressed up as strategy. It buys time, it doesn't buy safety. And treating the two as the same thing is exactly the kind of decision that tends to look reckless in hindsight. You'd think 3 years of watching Ukrainian drone range keep expanding would have taught Russian naval planners not to treat any single number of kilometers as a permanent safety margin. It didn't. Ochamchire is proof that far enough for now keeps getting redefined downward, and Russian commanders keep relearning that lesson one relocation at a time. There's a second layer to this story that doesn't get enough attention, and it has nothing to do with drones. It's about visibility. Commercial satellite operators now photograph most of the world's coastline on a rotating schedule that anyone can access, often for free or for the price of a subscription. Providers whose imagery regularly turns up in open-source naval analysis revisit stretches of contested coastline every few days, sometimes more often when analysts flag a location as worth watching closely. Ship tracking services broadcast vessel positions in near real time through transponder data that, even when a warship tries to go dark, can often still be inferred from the behavior of nearby commercial traffic. Naval analysts, journalists, and open-source researchers cross-reference both against Ukrainian naval intelligence statements almost as soon as they're published. That means Ochamchire isn't hidden, it's watched, continuously, by more independent eyes than Russian naval planners can realistically account for or deceive. Every time a Ropucha-class ship enters or leaves that harbor, there's a reasonable chance someone outside Russia's military notices, timestamps it, and cross-references it against everything else that's been logged. Obscurity, in an era of open-source satellite coverage, isn't the same thing it used to be. That visibility problem hasn't gone unnoticed inside the Russian Navy, and there's evidence it's driving at least some quiet countermeasures beyond simply relocating ships further away. At other Black Sea anchorages, Russian forces have experimented with floating anti-drone barriers, networks of buoys and netting strung across harbor mouths meant to snag a low, fast-moving hull before it reaches its target. They've deployed small patrol boats specifically tasked with intercepting sea drones on approach, though several of those interceptor boats have themselves been struck and sunk by the very threat they were sent out to stop. Electronic warfare trucks and shipboard jammers have been moved into position at some ports to try to sever the satellite links these drones depend on for long-range guidance. None of these measures have proven reliably effective anywhere they've been tried so far, and open-source imagery of Ochamchire's harbor mouth as of this year doesn't show the kind of dense netting or barrier infrastructure visible at some other, more heavily defended anchorages, suggesting whatever countermeasures exist there, if any, remain minimal. Would you have noticed the signs before it was too late? If you were the one responsible for defending that anchorage? Because the ships are visible, the port's limited defenses are visible. The pattern of relocation itself, Sevastopol, then Novorossiysk, then further south still, is visible to anyone tracking Black Sea naval movement in 2026. The only thing that hasn't happened yet, as of this video, is a strike on Ochamchire specifically. Everything that would make one possible is already sitting in plain sight. So let's actually walk through what a strike on that anchorage would look like, using nothing but the capabilities Ukraine has already demonstrated elsewhere in this war. This isn't a claim that it has happened. It's the arithmetic laid out plainly, because that arithmetic is the entire argument this video is built around. Launch point: Ukrainian-controlled coastal water, likely somewhere along the western Black Sea, where Magura-family drones have operated before. Distance to Ochamchire, roughly 600 kilometers. Well inside the range, these units have already demonstrated against other targets earlier in the war. Route: open water for most of the transit, staying low enough to avoid most radar horizons, corrected periodically by satellite navigation and remote operators watching a live feed. A mission profile like this would likely be broken into phases: an initial high-speed run out of the immediate coastal danger zone, a long fuel-conserving cruise across open water at a steadier pace to maximize range, and a final low-speed, high-caution approach once the target harbor's outer buoys or navigation markers come into camera view. The obstacle at this stage isn't the distance, it's detection and jamming. Russian forces have deployed electronic warfare systems specifically to disrupt drone navigation and control links along stretches of Black Sea coastline. A jammed signal can send a drone off course or kill it outright before it ever reaches a target. Ukrainian units have adapted by hardening navigation systems against interference and building in autonomous waypoint behavior, so a drone that briefly loses its link doesn't simply drift and die. It holds course toward its last known waypoint until contact is restored, effectively coasting through a jammed zone rather than aborting the mission the moment interference appears. Weather is the other quiet obstacle nobody talks about enough. A surface drone riding low against the waterline is far more vulnerable to sea state than people assume. Rough water can swamp a hull, throw off camera stabilization, or simply slow a mission past the point where fuel margins hold. Ukrainian naval drone planners reportedly build weather windows into mission timing specifically because of this, waiting, sometimes for days, for a calm enough stretch of Black Sea conditions to make a 600-kilometer transit survivable for the hardware itself. That patience is itself a kind of tactical discipline that's easy to overlook when you only see the headline result of a successful strike. Behind every one of those headlines is likely a string of scrubbed or postponed missions that never made the news because nothing happened. Once a drone, or a small group of them, reaches the harbor approach, the final obstacle is simply target selection, in the dark, at speed, against a berthed vessel that isn't moving and isn't actively defending itself the way a warship underway would be. A harbor guard crew tasked with defending a berthed Ropucha typically has only a handful of tools available on short notice: deck-mounted machine guns that require a spotted target and a clear line of fire, handheld flares to illuminate the water, and a radio link back to shore-based command that itself takes precious seconds to relay a warning. None of that was designed with a low, fast, nearly invisible surface threat in mind, because none of it existed when these ships and their standard defensive doctrine were designed decades ago. Multiple drones launched as a coordinated group complicates any single-point defense response even further. A harbor guard crew that spots and engages one inbound hull may not have time or ammunition left for a second or third approaching from a slightly different bearing seconds later. That's the moment the entire exchange ratio argument stops being theoretical. A few $100,000 of hull and warhead, correctly guided, against a ship valued in the hundreds of millions, sitting still, in a harbor with a fraction of Crimea's air defense density. That's the arithmetic, not a prediction of when, not a claim about what's already happened, just the honest math of what's already technically possible, laid against a port Russia has treated as a long-term safe haven for a fleet it cannot afford to keep losing pieces of. Here's the layer of this story that makes it more than a simple math problem. Russia doesn't actually have a good alternative to Ochamchire right now. Sevastopol is compromised. Novorossiysk is compromised. Moving the amphibious force back to either would mean returning to exactly the exposure that triggered these relocations in the first place. Moving it somewhere else entirely on the Black Sea means finding a location with even less naval infrastructure than Ochamchire already has, which creates its own operational headaches for actually running an amphibious force. Even options outside the Black Sea proper, surging ships around through other basing arrangements, would mean giving up the ability to project amphibious power into the theater at all, defeating the purpose of keeping these ships in the region in the first place. So the fleet is, in a real sense, cornered. Not physically trapped, the ships can still move, but strategically boxed in between a set of locations that are either already proven vulnerable or too underdeveloped to function as a real naval base. That's the quiet crisis sitting underneath every calm-looking satellite image of Ropuchas tied up peacefully at Ochamchire's docks in 2026. We dug through open-source naval tracking commentary covering this stretch of coastline, and here's what didn't make it into most mainstream coverage. Several independent naval analysts have flagged the same concern Ukrainian naval intelligence has been signaling for months: that Ochamchire's limited air defense footprint isn't a temporary gap waiting to be filled. It's a structural limitation of the port itself. There's simply not enough existing infrastructure to bolt on Crimea-level protection without a construction effort that would take a long time and remain visible to satellite coverage the entire way. Dredging a shallow harbor deep enough for larger escort vessels, pouring the concrete for hardened revetments, laying the cable and power infrastructure a modern radar and missile defense network requires. None of that happens quietly, and none of it happens fast. Picture the two futures branching from here. In one, Russia quietly accepts the risk, keeps its amphibious force at Ochamchire, and hopes distance keeps working the way it's worked so far. In the other, Ukrainian sea drone range keeps extending the way it has, every single time Russia has relocated these ships before, and the port that looked like a permanent solution turns out to be the third stop on a retreat that hasn't actually ended. Everything documented so far in this war points toward the second outcome. Nothing points toward the first. That's not a comfortable place for Russian naval planners to sit. Every additional Ropucha lost narrows the amphibious force further. Every relocation costs time, fuel, and operational tempo the fleet doesn't have to spare. And every month that passes gives Ukrainian drone engineers more data, more range, more precision against exactly this kind of target. There's a version of this story where none of that matters, where Ochamchire really does sit just far enough outside the threat envelope to stay safe indefinitely. But nothing about how this war has unfolded on the Black Sea supports betting on that version. Every single safe position the fleet has held has eventually stopped being safe. There's no evidence Ochamchire is structurally different from Sevastopol or Novorossiysk in that regard. It's just further away, for now. One detail that stuck with me while researching this: none of the relocations were framed publicly by Russian officials as retreats. Each one was described in routine, almost bureaucratic language: repositioning, redeployment, standard rotation. That language never changed even as the pattern underneath it became impossible to miss. 3 moves. Same reason each time. Same quiet admission dressed differently. What this tells us about the broader war is worth sitting with for a moment. A fleet built around large, expensive, hard-to-replace platforms is structurally disadvantaged against a threat built around small, cheap, rapidly iterated ones. That imbalance doesn't get fixed by moving further away. It gets fixed, if it gets fixed at all, by closing the technology gap. Better detection, better jamming, better point defense against exactly this class of threat. Russia has invested in some of that. So far, none of it has stopped the pattern. And every month spent relocating ships instead of solving the underlying vulnerability is a month Ukrainian engineers spend iterating on exactly the systems that created the problem in the first place. A gap that, if anything, seems to be widening rather than closing as this war grinds into its next phase. There's a piece of this story we couldn't fully verify for this video: specific figures on how much additional air defense hardware, if any, Russia has quietly moved into the Ochamchire area in recent months. Open-source imagery from 2026 shows some activity around the port's perimeter, but nothing conclusive enough to state as fact. If you've seen sourced reporting on that specific detail, drop it in the comments. We read every one, And it's exactly the kind of gap that shapes whether this story has a very different second chapter. So, still think those Ropucha ships are safe 600 kilometers south of the fighting? Here's where this actually leaves things. Distance bought Russia's amphibious force time, not safety. Every relocation in this war has eventually been followed by exactly the threat it was meant to outrun. The exchange ratio between a Magura-family drone and a Ropucha-class landing ship is lopsided enough that a single successful strike would rank among the most efficient naval engagements of the modern era. And the port these ships are sheltering in right now offers a fraction of the protection they left behind in Crimea. None of that guarantees what happens next. It just tells you what the math has been saying, consistently, for as long as Ukraine's naval drone program has existed. Kilometers aren't armor. They're a countdown, and the clock has been running since the first ship left Sevastopol. If this kind of breakdown, real numbers, real range, real consequences, is what you come here for, subscribe. Because we're tracking exactly what happens at ports like this one, across the entire Black Sea, as 2026 continues. And if there's a specific ship, port, or system you want the next arithmetic breakdown built around, tell us in the comments. That's usually where the next video starts.